I'm just going to come right out and say it. The Scandal of Leadership by JR Woodward is the best book on leadership I've ever read. Seriously. Let me unpack that. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I have here The Scandal of Leadership by JR Woodward. Okay, I love this book. I gave that away right at the very beginning. But I do think it's worth unpacking a little bit more about why I liked it so much. And so to do that, I want to take you through my format of the main idea, research, readability, and my reaction to this book. Which, given that I loved it, this might be a little bit of a gushing review, but just take that for what it's worth. I do want to comment on some of the substance of the argument here. Okay, so the main idea of The Scandal of Leadership is, it is a leadership book. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with leadership books, particularly leadership books within the subset of Christian publishing, publishing for the church and for ministry leaders. I've liked and appreciated a lot of books on leadership. I've really disliked some others. It's a mixed bag. It's more of as a subgenre. It's more of a mixed bag for me than a lot of others. Nevertheless, I keep giving them a try, and I'm really glad I did with The Scandal of Leadership. But let me just say the main idea of this book is it's a theology of leadership. So it's a very explicitly theological argument. And it's an argument for the shape of kind of how leadership should be shaped in the church. But it's buttressed and supported by really deep engagement with a couple theologians and thinkers in particular, namely Walter Wink, Rene Girard, and William Stringfellow. A few of others are Jacques Ellul is sprinkled in there. Some other ones are referenced, of course, but those are the primary, I would say. And so what Woodward is doing is he's doing extraordinarily deep engagement with these key thinkers, and he's putting them in conversation with each other and tying together, synthesizing from their work a really rigorous theological framework for understanding leadership, particularly in the church, in the Christian church, I should say. And so what he's drawing on is Walter Wink's theology of the principalities and powers. He's drawing on Rene Girard's understanding of kind of mimetic desire and how mimesis plays out in human groups and through literature and religion and throughout human history. And then he's also talking about William Stringfellow's model of leadership as kind of a prophetic, incarnational leader who actually modeled this type of leadership in the church and wrote a lot about it. And so there's a lot more that could be added to the sources that J.R. Woodward is working with here, but those are the primary ones, and he's pulling them together in a really remarkable way, which in the way of putting these voices in conversation with each other, they all mutually kind of illumine each other. But J.R. Woodward is also tying together and bringing his own unique story to bear and his own unique insights and experiences to bear on the whole conversation to put together a really robust vision of leadership in the church that is distinctively Christian and distinctively takes the principalities and the powers written about in the New Testament and the Old Testament, but especially in the New Testament, with the utmost seriousness. And he's not afraid to speak with candor about the fallen leadership in recent years, especially in evangelical America at least, of the fallen leaders like the Mark Driscolls, who have, in his argument, given into the domination system of the principalities and powers and modeled their own leadership on the fallen principalities and powers of the world, and imitated them and led their communities into this mimetic rivalry of a Girardian mimetic rivalry and mimetic desire, which has just led to complete catastrophe. And so he's proposing an alternate vision to that, rooted in deep engagement with these theological texts and thinkers. And so the upshot then is a really comprehensive theological vision for a different kind of leadership in the church. So that's the main idea, and I loved it. I really loved it. And let me continue to tell you about why. So the research is part of why I loved it, and the research is the next thing to talk about, which really merits some comment on this book in particular. This book, in some ways, and I want this might sound worse than I mean it, but in some ways, big sections of this book are read like deep literature reviews. What J.R. Woodward has done, not only a lot of a lot of reading of different texts, but really deep and close readings of texts. So he has engaged incredibly deeply with Walter Wink, with Rene Girard, and many, many others. And also there's a whole section on the whole missional movement. With, if you are familiar with evangelicalism in America, you'll know the missional, you know what I mean when I say that. And he really summarizes broad swaths of even thinkers within that movement and their models of leadership. I mean, it's just, there's so many chapters. He takes a topic and he goes a deep literature review of what's going on in that world of thinking and publishing, and there's so many chapters on so many different thinkers and texts and books. It's really remarkable what he has pulled together in this project. And so the research plays a massive role in the argument that he's making, because he has such a deep engagement with all these thinkers. And so just as a personal example, I have been in Rene Girard has kind of been in my orbit as a reader for a long time. I've read so many Girardians. I've read so many people who love Rene Girard, but I've never actually read him. I have read some Walter Wink. I never read William Stringfellow. And so now I feel like now it's still secondary, it's still an interpretation, but I feel like Woodward has given me a really deep grasp of these thinkers' works, because I've read this book, because he goes to such great pains to root his arguments so deeply in the things that they have already, the work that they've done. And it's amazing, and it's amazing, just as a reading experience. I loved it because I love getting those kind of the scope of other people's work that I respect, but also having them put right in conversation with each other. I love that. But I also think it's an amazing resource. So if you're a leader of any sort in the church, especially, this book is an incredible gold mine of research for you. It's an amazing resource. And that leads me though to the readability, which is the next thing I want to comment on. And there's kind of two things in tension with the readability of this book. So I use the terms literature review. If you're put off by a literature review, you don't want to wade through kind of all of that summarizing and quoting and citing of these previous thinkers, I'll be honest, if you really don't like reading that kind of stuff, you might struggle with this one because it is a lot of that. I love that kind of stuff, so I burned through this book. I actually found the content so enthralling and so interesting, and I was so, especially there's this forward movement to the book in my experience of what's he going to do with this thinker? How is he going to put this thinker in conversation with the other thinker I just read about, and what is he building towards? And the cumulative case he's making was so enthralling to me that I just kept pushing forward and was genuinely excited to read through this book. I found it kind of a page turner, which is kind of funny to say. But I fully grant that might not be everybody's experience. And the book is long. It's quite long. I think it's around, it's 300 pages with another almost 100 pages just of footnotes and citations. So that gives you a sense of the kind of flavor of this book. It is very academic in that sense. But I will also say that the page-for-page style is very fluid. JR Woodward is someone who seems to have a lot of kind of pastoring experience, and I think his communication seems very strong, which is not surprising given that experience, that professional experience. So his communication style is very strong and very readable page for page, even though it is a lot of literature review and it is very long. So take those things together for what they're worth. There is a little bit of tension between those styles, but for me, I found it very readable and was so enthralled by the content itself and the review of those thinkers that I didn't find it to be off-putting in the slightest. But I recognize your mileage is going to vary with that. Okay, finally, my reaction to this book. I've already said over and over again that I love this book, and I really loved it. And I'll tell you why I loved it. I love the deep academic engagement with those thinkers. I think they're the right thinkers to bring to bear on the conversation. I loved Woodward's candor in talking about some of the leaders who have fallen away. I loved that he did it. I think he struck that balance very well. He doesn't overly focus on it. He doesn't do that to be titillating, or he doesn't try to glorify in a weird way these disasters of leadership, but he does speak about them forthrightly when necessary, and connects them to the arguments he's making about the principalities and powers. And that's the other thing I loved. I loved the fearless engagement with the idea of the principalities and powers. It's a fearless engagement with an idea that may not be super fashionable in the West, broadly, globally speaking, the idea of spiritual invisible forces. And so it's not maybe fashionable, but he also doesn't, part of the reason the book is so long and deep is because he is trying to do his utmost due diligence to think clearly and well about the principalities and powers. So he brings a very rigorous academic lens to bear on a conversation that might not be academically fashionable in our day and age, and yet he does it with boldness and confidence. And I loved that tone and that posture. And he's not afraid to critique someone like a Walter Wink or Rene Girard. He's not afraid to bring critiques to bear when that's necessary. But he just engages it all so thoughtfully, and the ways that he puts these thinkers in conversation with each other, like I said, reveal interesting nuances and facets of their own life and thought. There's a really fascinating theme of theology as biography or biography as theology, in which he brings to bear on all these thinkers that he's pulling on. And so I loved the comprehensiveness of it. I loved the scope of it. I loved the distinctive angle he's taking with looking at the principalities and powers. And I love the candor with which he discusses the situation we are in our cultural moment. And I am someone, as I'm a pastor reading this, and so this is very, very relevant to my own life as someone, I've been reflecting on my own leadership styles. And I've been personally wrestling with, for years now, what are the ways in which things like American capitalism, for example, entrepreneurial thing, is why I love Andy Root's books so much, which I've read, and I've interviewed Andy on this channel. He brings a similar, in fact, if you like Andy Root's work with cultural engagement, you're probably also going to love Scandal of Leadership, now that I think about that. But it's why I love those books too, because I love trying to bring an academic, rigorous kind of thought life to diagnosing the cultural forces that are at play that might be subtly or not so subtly influencing the ways that Christians lead their congregations. And how do we have more of a clear and bold thinking about those influences, and how do we repudiate them, but not without giving up any of the academic rootedness and the like intellectual rigor that I love to bring to bear so much in these conversations in my own leadership. And I just found Woodward's work here, The Scandal of Leadership, to be kind of all of those things. It represents all those desires I have to be clear thinking about culture, to be representing the scriptures well, representing philosophy and theology in its kind of best forms well, and integrating all of that into what is, at the end of the day, a book about leadership. It's about how does one lead, but specifically, how does one lead in this sense? How does one lead the church, and how does one lead refusing to be shaped by the domination system, as Walter Wink calls it, of the principalities and powers at work in our world? And oh my gosh, the ways that he defines the principalities and powers, the ways that he talks about emergent thinking, kind of the ways that these spiritual manifestations of these principalities, the ways that they emerge in our kind of social realities. Oh, it's just so thought-provoking and so good and so helpful. There's so many things about this book that have impacted me already, and I just finished it, and I'm going to be returning to certain chapters over and over, and I'm going to be really, I think, leaning on this text as kind of a load-bearing text for me when I think about leadership moving forward in my own life and work and ministry. So man, oh man, before this turns into too much of a rambling gush fest, I will end by saying that this book is a tremendous service to the church in particular, and to I think the concept of leadership in general in our culture. I think if you're a ministry leader, you absolutely owe it to yourself to get a copy of this and read it. But even if you're but if you are a person of faith, if you're a Christian, if that's an important part of your life, and you are in any sort of influence in any organization, whether that's a church or a job or something, which almost all of us have some measure of influence, then I think you should read this book too, because we're all called, I would argue, to leverage that leadership that we have, to steward it well, with an eye on the principalities and powers, as Woodward argues. So anyways, those are my thoughts on The Scandal of Leadership, an extraordinarily important book, one of probably my favorite books I've read this year, honestly, a book that I find is, absolutely worth the price and the time it takes to get through the content. So there you go. Hopefully I've convinced you to buy this book. But those are my thoughts on The Scandal of Leadership by JR Woodward. Thank you, JR, for, if you happen to watch this, thank you for writing this. Know that it is already bearing lots of good fruit. So as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.